Good morning, everyone. So 1 minute until 9. We're going to get started here shortly. If you require closed captioning, it is enabled. Feel free to turn it on. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording and materials will be made available at the PCHIP webpage today. We appreciate your attendance. Today, we will be having the this year 2024 PCHIP pre-proposal conference for interested applicants that may be applying for general fund, emergency solutions grant, or community development block grant funds. Quick housekeeping, all attendees have been automatically muted for today's presentation. Just to decrease background noise and make sure y'all get all the important details we're going to talk about today. If you have a question during the presentation, please pop it in the Q&A feature. It's located in the center of the toolbar of your window. It looks like the little bubbles when people speak to each other. Any questions that flow naturally into the presentation, will take a moment to answer during that time. If it's going to be disruptive, we'll hold them to the end. And any questions that maybe require additional consideration will be posted to the FAQ section of the PCHIP webpage. If you experience any technical difficulties, we recommend that you sign out and sign back in. That normally resolves it. If that's not helpful, please give Latifa an email. You can jot down her email address right there, and she will support you. Again, this webinar is going to be recorded, so if you have too exhaustive of technical difficulties, you can always look at the recording later. Today, your facilitator is going to be myself and the contract supervisor, but here on this contact sheet, you have Latifa Hill, our management assistant, her direct email address and number, and Jason Thorpe, the Planning Community Development Administrator. I'll give my colleague a moment to introduce yourself.
Yes, and hello, good morning. My name is Noemi Santana. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm the contract supervisor.
Thank you, Noemi. And I'm Austin Puka. I'm the Human Services Manager here for the Planning and Community Development Department, division. All right, let's get started. Today, we're gonna take some time to have well, let's look at the agenda for the day so you know what you're in store for. Noemi's gonna get us started with the funding opportunity overview. They'll walk us through the funding that's available, talk about the eligible project types, give an overview of the application, and discuss the performance period. Then we'll look at the particular funding programs, discuss their similarities, their differences, and any applicable regulatory or statutory requirements, and talk about the eligible project types under each program. Then I'll spend some time on evaluation criteria overview. We'll talk about required attachments and certifications. We'll dive into any special considerations that organizations would want to be proactively planning for. And we'll wrap up with a summary of the evaluation process, revisit the timeline, and take a look at some resources that were shared throughout the presentation, and a few others. Like I mentioned, we'll answer questions throughout the presentation as time allows, and at the end of the webinar, and anything that we do not have time to answer in today's live presentation will be posted to the FAQ section of the PCHIP call for projects webpage. All right, we'll let Noemi get us started with the funding opportunity overview.
Thank you, Austin. On November 21st, the City of Tucson began accepting PCHIP call for projects for the fiscal year 2024. Eligible applicants are not-for-profit organizations with IRS 501c3 or a C4 designation. City of Tucson departments, grassroots organizations without IRS, not-for-profit status, if they have a fiscal agent who meets all eligibility requirements, and neighborhood associations or groups without not-for-profit status, as long as they have a sponsoring city department acting as the fiscal agent. A link to the webpage where you will find the applications and all pertinent information is found here at the end of the presentation. So let's look at the specific program amounts. For the general fund, the City of Tucson anticipates receiving approximately $1.25 million and plans to make up to 24 awards. The minimum you can request is $50,000 and the maximum is $200,000. For the Emergency Solutions Grant, we anticipate to subaward an approximate total of $445,727. We expect to make one or more award under the following 3 funding priorities. All 3 funding priorities have a minimum request of $50,000. However, the maximum for domestic violence emergency is $75,000. For the emergency shelter service, the maximum is $120,000. For the rapid rehousing services, the maximum is $156,607. The City of Tucson anticipates to subaward approximately $700,000 for the Community Development Block Grant and anticipates to make up to 14 awards. Proposed budgets must be a minimum of $50,000 and no more than $200,000. The City of Tucson reserves the right to increase or decrease award budgets or to make no awards under this solicitation at its discretion. The funding amount is subject to change based on final HUD awarding. All applicants applying for ESG and CDBG federal funding must be registered with the U.S. Systems for Awards Management, also known as SAM, and need to have a valid SAM unique entity identifier at the time of application and must maintain eligibility requirement through the period of performance. Here is a chart that shows each eligible project type and funding source. You may apply for multiple funding sources and submit multiple applications under each PCHIP RFP, provided that you do not submit more than one application under any PCHIP RFP for the same project or activity. For example, you may submit 2 applications under ESG RFP as long as the 2 applications are for the different projects. You may also apply for CDBG, ESG, and General Fund RFP. The key is that each application is not duplicative in services. Have in mind that applications for emergency shelter and rapid rehousing projects must be submitted under the ESG RFP if you would like the project to be considered under multiple funding sources. Applications for emergency shelter and rapid rehousing submitted under the CDBG and General Fund RFP will only be evaluated for the single source under which the application is submitted and may be less likely to receive funding. So the application consists of 4 components and needs to be completed in Zoom Grants portal. All the applicable materials are found at the PCHIP webpage. The RFP materials include a PDF document that walks you through setting up your Zoom Grants account. Organizational information and contact information must be provided through the applicant and organization section of the proposal narrative or the application. During the pandemic, many organizations have experienced considerable staff transitions and changes. So please be sure that the contact information is up to date and that the person identified as the contact is aware so that they are responsive. Proposal narrative. The applicants are encouraged to fill out narrative questions at the best of their ability, considering the questions prompt and evaluation criteria defined in the request of proposal. Project budget and detailed budget narrative. Let me see. Applicant organizations are strongly encouraged to ensure that proposed activities are allowable and consistent with the city's priorities as developed through the local plan and the RFP. Applicants are also advised to propose lean competitive budgets which are prudent, reasonable, and necessary to deliver proposed services. Austin will go into more details on the things to consider to submit a competitive RFP application. And the last component, but just as important, is to include all 18 attachments and certifications, which Austin will go over in detail in future slides. All required components must be submitted in Zoom Grants applications portal by 11:59 p.m. Arizona time on January 10th. Okay. So what's new? What's changed? So advancing racial equity and inclusion is a priority that is critical in grant making at all levels of the homeless response system. To meet that priority, applications should identify partnerships and internal practices to promote racial equity. Eligible applicants have the responsibility to analyze program data to ensure all eligible persons are receiving equitable services and are served with dignity, respect, and compassion regardless of circumstances, ability, or identity. Eligible and competitive applications should demonstrate the organization's capacity to evaluate and respond to disproportionality in access to services, utilization of provided services, and outcomes achieved. The questions listed in the advanced racial equity section of the RFP should be used in the applicant's internal evaluation process. Each question directly corresponds to the respective threshold review criteria and community review panel evaluation criteria. The City of Tucson strongly encourages all applicants to consider all questions prior to beginning the project application in order to promote equitable project design and improve the organization's ability to respond to narrative questions and requirements in the application. Moving on to the progressive spending requirements and recapture provisions. All projects funded under this solicitation are expected to progressively spend and invoice the city at the rate of 25% or more of awarded cost per quarter. Projects funded under this solicitation shall be subject to the following recapture provisions. Let me see. Funds in excess of 50% of the total grant award not expended by December 31st, 2023 will be recaptured unless alternative arrangements were made with the City of Tucson. Funds in excess of 25% of the total grant award not expended by March 31st, 2024 will be recaptured by the City of Tucson unless alternative arrangements were made with the City of Tucson. Alternative arrangements will only be made in the case of awards which include large projects expected to occur at a specific time later in the year. And second year funding, the city may at its discretion award a second year of funding at the same or an adjusted budget amount covering an additional 12 months in the periods of July 1st, 2024 and June 30th, 2025. This is subject to satisfactory project performance, sub-award grant expenditure, and a continued availability of funds. Okay, performance period. The initial performance period for funding issued under this solicitation shall be July 1st, 2023 through June 30th, 2024. Renewals. There are three factors when determining contract renewals. The first factor for renewal is subject to city continued availability of funding. The second factor is the agency's project performance, which includes agency demonstrated capacity to meet program objectives, outcomes, timely submission of payment requests and reports, and compliant and timely completion of required HMIS program entry, exit, and updates. The third factor is the agency expenditure of funding, the demonstrated history of spending, the full award and spending it in fidelity with the approved budget, and submitting compliant, timely payment request, and tracking applicable required match. Extensions. The city is not obligated to extend projects which have not expended the full program budget by the end of the performance period. Selection under this competition does not obligate the city to extend the performance period beyond June 30th, 2024. So as I mentioned earlier, November 21st was the day that the PCHIP call for projects was released. Today, December 12th, we are conducting the PCHIP pre-proposal conference. And once a week, each Monday, responses to your frequently asked questions will be posted to the PCHIP webpage. The last day to submit your project application questions is January 5th. On January 10th, applications are due by 11:59 p.m. Arizona time in Zoom grants. The funding recommendations must first be reviewed and approved by City of Tucson Mayor and Council prior to our announcement. March 1st is the anticipated date that funding award recommendations will be announced. Okay. Okay. Now I will go over each individual funding source. I will be starting with the general fund. Because general funds are not federally funded, these are appropriate for grassroots-like organizations that have modest staff and organizational capacity. Organizations may apply for general fund grants under one or more of the following priority areas. Addressing and preventing homelessness. Examples of eligible project types under this funding priority include, but are not limited to, street outreach and housing navigation programs, emergency shelters, and medical respite. Promoting access to healthcare and food security. A few examples of these, the eligible project types under this funding are medical outreach and health promotions activity, food banks, meal distribution programs, and benefits coordinator services. Training, education, and employment. Examples of eligible project types under this funding priority include early childhood education, educational enrichment programs, and job training programs. Some transportation and mobility are paratransit services, transportation programs for low-income older adults and persons with disabilities. Access to quality affordable housing. Some examples of eligible projects are minor home repair programs and supportive services for tenant of low-income and or public housing communities. Advancing equity and inclusion project examples are services for persons with disabilities and fair housing activities. Advancing City of Tucson housing and community development priorities and initiatives. Projects submitted under this priority area must further the goal of a current initiative or effort underway with the City of Tucson Housing and Community Development Department and be pre-approved for submission by the City of Tucson Housing Community Development Director. Few examples of eligible project types under this funding opportunity include victim services like domestic abuse hotlines, human trafficking programs, and homeless outreach projects, which will operate in partnership with the City of Tucson Homeless Protocol. The City of Tucson Housing and the Community Development Department will not fund projects through this solicitation, which do not directly address one or more of the PCHIP priority areas. Okay, now I will go over the Emergency Solutions Grant. HUD awards the City of Tucson ESG funding annually to reach the federal goals. And this funding's year purpose is to engage in individuals and families experiencing unsheltered homelessness, to improve the number of quality of emergency shelters for individuals and family experiencing homelessness, help operate these shelters and provide, essential services to shelter participants. Consideration here would be whether persons with lived experience that were served in current and recent projects be included in the planning, implementation, and or evaluation of the proposed project. To rapidly rehouse individuals and families experiencing homelessness and to prevent individuals and families from becoming homeless. A consideration in this area would be the organization's capacity to ensure housing stability of program participants demonstrated in historic system performance data. Specific measures to consider include exit leading to permanent housing, destinations, and increased income. There are 3 ESG eligible project types allowed to advance local priorities and goals. First is the domestic violence emergency shelter for individuals and families fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and or human trafficking. Individuals and families meeting the above definition who lack other resources need to maintain housing stability. The second project type allowed is emergency shelter for unsheltered persons. Individuals and families experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Projects may include overnight and day shelter services and day shelters providing heat relief during the summer. And lastly, rapid rehousing, which provides rapid rehousing assistance for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Program funds may be used to provide housing relocation and stabilization services and short-term and or medium-term rental assistance. Another funding source is the Community Development Block Grant. This funding's purpose is to develop a thriving urban community through housing, expansion of community services, neighborhood revitalization, economic development, and elimination of slum and blight or rundown neighborhoods. Federally eligible activities which do not deliver one or more of the PCHIP priorities defined in the collective impact measures heading of the RFP will not be funded. CDBG program funds promote flexible approaches to achieve federal goals. Hence, the exhaustive eligible activities listed on page 8 of the CDBG RFP. Applicants should evaluate proposed activities for their capacity to meet the collective impact identified by the City of Tucson Annual Action Plan, which Austin will expand on in the evaluation criteria overview. All CDBG project types will be required to report on medium-term outcomes collected 90 days after service participation ends. Projects funded under this solicitation are expected to ensure 75% or greater participation in follow-up activities among the exiting project participants. Applicants are encouraged to include participant incentives or other appropriate strategies within the project design to promote successful collection of this follow-up data from project participants after the exit. One strategy example is to provide eligible incentives of or cash incentives through non-CDBG sources for response to a follow-up call or email to provide needed information. Eligible project types under this funding are those that address and prevent homelessness through eviction and homeless prevention, community outreach and education, street outreach, housing navigation and benefits coordination services, and shelter and supportive housing services. It provides training, education, and employment through job training, career readiness programs, early childhood education, school-age child programs, training and secondary, post-secondary education programs, education outreach and enrollment services. It promotes access to healthcare and food security through food and meal distribution services, one-time food assistance projects, health benefit access and enrollment services, physical and behavioral health services. It provides transportation and mobility through transportation assistance services, bicycle and alternative transportation education and assistance. It will provide access to quality, affordable housing through supportive services for voucher holders and low-income and public housing tenants, advance equity and inclusion through participant-focused projects, and advanced City of Tucson HCD priorities by providing crisis services and other projects. Subjects submitted under this priority area must have the pre-approval of the Housing and Community Director.
Thank you, Noemi. And I don't see any questions popping in the chat so far. Thank you for that thorough and detailed overview. All right, y'all, let's look at this evaluation criteria. Eligible applications for funding are going to be reviewed in a two-step evaluation process. That first step would be the threshold review. Threshold is an objective review, and it certifies that the minimum requirements have been met. The threshold review does not inform or quantify the effort or quality of the application submitted. What does do that is the evaluation criteria located on Exhibit B in all three of the RFPs. It's a qualitative determination that's assessed based on the project narrative, the submitted attachments, the thoroughness and accuracy of what's submitted, and the completeness of all the provided materials. And this evaluation is what establishes the recommendations that will move forward for approval by mayor and council. Now, I mentioned there are about 18 attachments that you need to provide, and you'll see them listed here. And many of them are common, and many of the folks in this presentation have submitted applications before and familiar with them. We will take time to look at some special considerations for particular attachments. And if you have any questions about a particular attachment that we do not dedicate to, please pop that in the chat. All right, so criteria, the threshold review criteria, which is applicable across all programs, and some considerations for some of those attachments. For your board of directors and your staff rosters and diversity worksheet, you really want to be certain that there's that it's representative of the local community populations that your organization serves. So if your organization is primarily serving young people, you would take a look and see if your staff and board diversity is majority folks that are age 55 and plus, right? That wouldn't be representative of the community or population. Your adopted organizational budget for the current fiscal year should be fiscally solvent. And what that means is, right, that your organizational capacity to pay your financial obligations in a timely manner does not exceed liquid capital that would be left over, right? And you want to be able to demonstrate a diverse array of revenue sources, and that really just shows you have a diverse funding portfolio and able to meet applicable match or provide additional supportive services to the folks in your projects. And then your cost should be appropriate to the project size and complexity. If your cost for serving 3 people, is $500,000, we want to be figuring out what is complex to serve those 3 folks. The organizational chart should demonstrate an appropriate structure and staffing levels and really identify a separation of duties, and should demonstrate a capacity to be adherent and compliant with statutory and regulatory requirements. Your most recent financial audit. So that, right, if projects funded federally over $750,000 are able to use a single audit, you would want to make sure that it is whatever audit that you're needing to provide is not dated more than 18 months prior to the application deadline. And so we see some math here, right? The deadline is January 10th, 2023. 12 months from that would be January 11th, 2022. And to make it 18 months, you go back 6 more, and you end up with that audit needing to have been completed not more or not sooner than June 11th, 2021. And your audits need to not, like a competitive application would include audits that do not have repeat findings of non-compliance, or any significant unresolved financial management concern. For your equity and non-discrimination policies, you want to be sure that, all right, let's pause. We have a question here about independently certified financial statements. Yes, so this was asked and answered in the FAQ, right, for agencies that are needing those independently certified financial statements. You are able, you gather all your different financial statements and you get with a certified, public accountant that reviews them for like risk and that y'all have met your obligations throughout the year, and to be that you're fiscally solvent. If you are needing additional support in identifying someone that may be eligible to serve as your independent financial statement auditor, feel free to reach out at the HCD grants at TucsonAZ.gov. Equity and non-discrimination policies. Your agency will need to return those policies, and they must prohibit discrimination other protected classes listed in the RFP. Rule of thumb when you're thinking of federal applications is the difference between may and must. May is more flexible. It gives organizations and projects opportunity to, design programs, within the limitations of their organization. But if a requirement is that you must do something, that means it has to be there. So your non-discrimination policies, right, because they must prohibit it, they would need to explicitly state that. It can't discourage, or advise against. It needs to prohibit. It must include proactive measures to promote racial and social justice equity, both in the workplace and the programs the organization provides to the community. For organizational time and effort reporting policies and the time and effort reporting sample, you want to be certain that the policies include internal controls that ensure that your costs are accurate, allowable, and allocable. So what does that really mean, right? We went over the eligible project types, right? And we know Emergency Solutions Grant Services has more project types than you saw on that screen, right? And so, right, that what you saw were the allowable project types. Within that, the different activities, right, that you would propose budgets for, then let those charges be allocable. So you want to be certain that your organizational time and effort sample is able to display how a person's salary, fringe benefits were coded to the proper allocations. And they must have been completed within 90 days of that submission. So a little additional math, right? 90 days from January 10th would put you October 12th. And the RFP mentions that if a standard tracking form needs to be submitted, that needs to be implemented for the duration of your performance period. Right, a little more consideration here. For your record retention, they need to be available for at least 5 years after the expenditure of all funds of your final award. So we know that we're talking about the FY24 PCHIP, and it may be kind of common to think 5 years from 24, but what this is saying is, right, and we mentioned earlier the potential of renewals or extensions. So from the final expenditure, 5 years from that date, the project was awarded and then renewed, making its final expenditure date in 2025, and you would retain your records until 2030. And that would include, right, documentation records of client participation, procurement contracts, data, and your procurement contracts would need to be adequately documented for compliance. An example of that would be an agency that is funded for outside services would need to complete the subcontractor subrecipient determination and follow the procurement policies outlined in the financial policies and procedures provided. Equity and non-discrimination policies, just to reiterate some of what Noemi already mentioned, should involve affirmative outreach and that includes data and action, right? So data gathered related to race, ethnicity, disability, status, and family characteristics, and how does that, right, inform the actions that further fair housing within the organization. There's an indirect cost affidavit applicable to our federal sources. And Office of Management and Budget defines indirect costs as costs incurred for a common or joint purpose of benefiting more than one cost objective. And simply stated, right, those are the common or joint costs that cannot be tied directly to the program or program participant. So general business expenses that keep you operating, rent, utilities, general office expenses. And you'll see a link to the indirect cost toolkit located on HUD Exchange if anyone's needing like additional technical assistance with mapping out indirect costs. If you are going to be utilizing indirect and submit that indirect cost affidavit, then an indirect cost, a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement needs to be provided. That needs to be legible, right? We know that we're working a lot in digital formats these days, and piece of a copy of a copy, right? If any of the attachments provided during the solicitation are, you know, egregiously illegible, that would be considered a non-responsive submission and would not move further for recommendation. And that negotiated indirect cost rate agreement needs to be current, and it must be consistent throughout. So if your proposal lists that you're going to be using 14%, your budget shouldn't say 12%, and the affidavit shouldn't say 8%. So consistency across and throughout. Some special consideration, right? The application mentions priority populations for applicants that intend to serve a priority population. You want to keep in mind that an assessment of the need to serve that population is required. So a documented need of services for that those vulnerable communities. We think about community development block grant funding and the national objectives, right? So for those that are going, Noemi mentioned the City of Tucson's continuity plan and annual action plan, and that's what identifies the national objectives for our CDBG funds that are allocated. So your CDBG applicants need to indicate that they would be serving participants that are exclusively low to moderate income or located in the exclusive servicing geographic area that's eligible under the low to moderate income area benefit. And for projects that are going to service presumed benefit populations, all of the folks served in that project need one or more of them need to be eligible from that presumed benefit population. Considerations for emergency solutions grant applications. right? We know that there are the 3 eligible types that Noemi mentioned: DV shelter, emergency shelter services for unsheltered folks, and rapid rehousing. So projects need to be low barrier, housing focused, and can take a housing first approach, meaning that they're not preconditioned to a participant engaging in services. And supportive services must be voluntary. And it can be common when services are voluntary to just let them exist as voluntary, but right, project staff really need to be promoting that those voluntary supportive services are available to participants to support them in it being their housing stability and positively impacting resiliency in their outcomes. Okay, so we talked about the threshold, right? So once project applications have been reviewed and determined to meet that minimum threshold, and they advance to community review. And that is also a 2-part approach. So part 1, which is by City of Tucson staff, is your equity impact analysis. And right, analysis really refers to studying the subject matter to determine the understanding and application of essential concepts. So right, race equity, right? This city staff will do an objective review of the materials submitted to assess the organization's commitment to representative leadership and decision making. And earlier when we spoke about advancing equity, we spoke of representative leadership of the population and community the organization aims to serve. Part 2 of the evaluation criteria, Exhibit B, is the community review panel, which is a qualitative review. That's where the effort and quality of the full project narrative application is assessed. And qualitative review refers to studying quality of information provided, the completeness, and that all the required attachments also demonstrate the organizational capacity to meet City of Tucson priorities. Could never look at the timeline enough, right? So, right, the call for projects released a few weeks ago on November 21st, and it is located on the PCHIP call for projects webpage that's throughout this presentation. December 12th, that's today, this lovely, lugubrious, rainy day. It's your pre-proposal conference. Questions that are submitted to the HCD grants at TucsonAZ.gov webpage are responded to and did weekly on Mondays. So continue to send your questions and check back for responses as needed. Remember that the last day to submit project application questions is January 5th. And then your project applications, your beautiful, legible, complete, accurate, federally compliant project applications are due in the Zoom grant application portal by 11:59 Arizona time. If you're someone that's got the benefit of working telecommuted and in a different time zone, please do what you need to remember you're on Arizona time, 11:59 January 10th. And as Noemi mentioned earlier, all of the recommendations for funding need to be reviewed and approved by mayor and council. And we are hopeful and anticipate being able to announce funding recommendations March 1st. Here's a page of resources. Some of these were linked throughout the presentation, right? Here you have the PCHIP Call for Projects webpage. Pretty sure y'all have all been there a bunch of times and maybe sick of me saying PCHIP webpage. The People, Community, and Homes Investment Plan can be found at that second link there, and the Housing Affordability Strategy Tucson is also linked. The applicable federal regulations that govern the eligible project types and the compliance requirements are linked here for Emergency Solutions Grant and CDBG. And the Indirect Cost Toolkit is also linked here. There's a Zoom grant tutorial slideshow that Noemi hunted down for y'all. Earlier, Noemi mentioned the U.S. Systems for Award Management. So we've linked here for agencies that may be still needing to visit that. And lastly, HMIS policies, procedures, the Tucson Payment Collaboration and Homelessness Plan to Prevent Homelessness, and the ESG system performance measures can all be found at the tpch.net webpage under governing documents. At this time, I think we're ready to dive into any questions and answers. I don't see additional ones posted. We have had our administrators joined us since we got started. If there are any updates or considerations you'd like to highlight, feel free.
No, I'm just grateful that everyone is here and interested in this opportunity.
Well, I don't know, y'all. We don't have any questions rolling in. All right, we have one coming in. Looks like. Regarding allowable CDBG expenses. I'm not sure if there's more to come. Or we have time and there's not a ton of people.
Austin, it appears that Marissa may be trying to ask a question in the Q&A, but it's not entirely coming, which I hear you kind of reading. I'm wondering if maybe we could just allow
unmute.
Unmute Marissa. Give her the opportunity.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Sorry, I can only type so fast. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so my question is specifically for our CDBG allowable expenses. If our program will pay for utility or rental payments for youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability, do the vendors need to be external vendors, or are payments allowed by, does HUD allow payments to be made to the youth, and then where the youth would then turn around and pay their bill themselves? We used to get funding for CDBG funding for a program like this, but we've since kind of shifted how those expenses are paid, and now they're going directly to the youth in many cases. So I'm wondering if that is an allowable, it's a very specific question, but wondering if that's allowable with HUD and CDBG.
Thanks, Marissa. If I'm understanding your question, you're asking the like financial assistance payments to support young people could be paid directly to those participants. And Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not believe that that is allowable.
That is correct. So, if any financial assistance payments have to be made to the vendor, they cannot be made to the program participant. Additionally, I think it's important there to note, just because this is coming up as a kind of specific question, and I know the folks at YODO are familiar with the 90-day requirement, having done this in the past, but for anyone who's hearing that question, it's also important to know those types of payments with CDBG program funds cannot be made for more than a period of 90 days for any single participant. So CDBG is really not the best funding source if you're trying to do things like emergency rent and utility assistance. That's better to apply for that funding under general funds, honestly, where there's less of that challenge area. In CDBG, though, it is allowable, but they're considered income payments under the Community Development Block Grant rules by HUD and are limited to one 90-day period during the individual's participation in the program.
Perfect. That's what I thought. Just wanted to double check. Thank you, Jason and Austin.
Oh, and it looks like there's also a question from Betty Bitgood that asks for more information on independently certified financial statements. So Betty, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Well, I've allowed you to talk. You can now unmute yourself, which should allow you to ask that question, just so that we can give maybe a little more clarity as to the question.
Well, as you know, Jason, we're very small. We don't, we've been working out of our homes. We don't have any staff, paid staff. We're all volunteer. And I'm not sure how to handle those documents. There are about 5 of them that I don't know how to submit because of that, because of our smallness.
Sure. So I think to the point of the independent financial statements, if you've in the past not had a CPA review your financials on an annual basis and provide a sort of independent assessment, which is, it's sort of the smaller organization's alternative to an audit, you can provide a letter to us explaining that this year, and to know that you would be required to do that if you were to be funded through this competition. You would have to have outside financial evaluation as part of your grant agreement. Without knowing what those other items are, I can think some things, Betty. I know there's like an example about payroll, right? And like time and effort reporting. And if an organization is all volunteer driven, I think simply attaching a letter, it's like a simple 1-page, like our organization is 100% volunteer driven and therefore we don't have payroll. That's going to be allowable, assuming that you're not asking for funding for staff for this project. If you are asking to create staff positions, then you need to have all of those pieces in place. You need to be able to say, this is how we would document time and effort reporting, for example, if we're going to pay staff through this grant, even if that's new to us. So there is an extent, but you do have to be kind of ready for the funding at the time of application. And I think if there are more specific, those individual items for Hope of Glory or for any of the other organizations on the call where you may be smaller, we know that sometimes federal funding and even like the local government funding can be kind of intimidating because there are these requirements and these processes in place. And I really encourage you to reach out to us. We want to be diversifying the mix of organizations we're working with. We want to be working with smaller scale organizations. And so we want to help you succeed in the competition in that way.
Thank you, Jason. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Any additional questions? I don't see any. Well, we appreciate your attendance and the questions that were asked. And if you think of some after you sign off, you're always welcome to submit them at that hcgrant@tucsonaz.gov. And we look forward to receiving your application. Have a great day, y'all.